Good afternoon, English 123. Welcome to week 5. Today we're going to be talking mostly about plagiarism and how to better prevent it. We're also talking about some minor changes to the course. So to get started on that, we're going to go first to those changes. And I think I want to kind of give you some context for what's going on. Attendance policy is changing. Now, as you recall, the attendance policy has never been to penalize you for attendance. It's been to incentivize it. And I realized that tying it to the book as I had didn't really reflect the shift to online teaching, or to asynchronous online, I should say. I think that this type of text is very discussion oriented, and I think to not having planned to engage with you directly in a face-to-face back and forth real time, but still use that text maybe wasn't the best choice as far as pedagogically valuing your time here. Clearly, based on several ways I can track it, you're engaging with this course content very radically asynchronously. You're not posting, or you're not responding to my videos or watching my videos immediately when they come out. And I think that maybe I should change this to reflect that. So, as you know, I did intentionally remove week 3's reading because I just wanted to give you time to work on content. Week 4, I just kind of let it go because I was trying to figure out how I wanted to change this. And so now there are no more readings and no more discussions for the readings. Conference draft meetings next week, which we're talking about later this week in detail, replace the remainder of those readings. So essentially week 4, 5, and 6 is attendance, which is used, again, to remind you from this syllabus, simply as a way to determine if someone gets an attendance bump, a grade bump at the end of the semester if they're eligible. So that one meeting will take care of week 4, 5, and 6's attendance. So if you still did week 1 and 2, then you're still totally fine for participating in the course's content, and that will still count the same way originally I planned. It's just that the one-on-one meeting I planned for next week will definitely be higher value for the attendance portion and therefore the grade bump portion. Beyond that, we have 2 things to kind of talk about related to the course structure. We have shorter lectures really after today's lecture. This is the last long one I plan for the rest of the semester. Our class size makes one-on-one conversation a little bit more possible now. Originally, we had 15 people, 1 quickly withdrew, and we've had 4 more withdraw in the past couple weeks. And now we're essentially at 8 to 10 active participants in the course. So I want to give you the option to, if you'd like, just take a one-on-one meeting with me before we get to the conference draft. That way, if you want to talk about what you're writing for it, the content choices you're making, I can absolutely have half an hour conversation with you when I only have 10 of you. Something I can't do when I have a normal semester of 60 to 90 students. Let's take advantage of that. If you want to talk with me about anything that's going on with the course or your conference draft, now is the time. I'll be available pretty much most of the rest of the week with only minor blockouts. So feel free to let me know, and we can see if I can help you with that, or if you want to run something by me. So let's get into plagiarism. As you know, I put out a survey last week asking you to assess something as plagiarism, not at all, or horrible, intentional. I think I find this to be one of the most helpful things we can do, because you may have some ambiguity over what really plagiarism is. A lot of times we just worry about the cutoff between the big bad P, intentional plagiarism, and a lowercase p, unintentional, accidental plagiarism. So talking about that space and how things get close is good to do. And so having you grade those, and then us talking about, or me talking to you about the rationale, how I see it, is a good choice to let you normalize with me. So there's no ambiguity going forward. And I think you can trust, of course, you're going to run into the exception, I'm sure, sometime. I think you can trust that I'm fairly representative of most instructors' understanding of plagiarism. Although, again, you will run into the occasional out there who sees any small misstep as reportable. So be aware of them out there. All right. Scenario 1, Reg waited until the last minute to write his paper. Reg, you fool. He knows Data took English 123 last semester and wrote a similar paper. So Reg takes the final draft of Data's paper and rewrites it. He uses the same sources and quotations, and he rewrites the explanation to sound more like himself. He adds a new intro and conclusion, but it's essentially Data's thesis and essentially Data's comment or content. You say 4.6, which is actually one of the hardest grades I've seen on this scenario before. So apparently I have some sticklers here, which is good. I agree, this is a 4. I think Reg maybe made a good faith effort to try and change things up, and maybe Reg thought he was making changes that showed his agency, but it wasn't enough. This is still ultimately intentional use of someone else's content. Is it just outright taking Data's paper and swapping his name out? No, therefore it's not a 5, but it's still enough to report and still pretty bad. So we're in agreement on this. Laren has been working on her paper for a comp class, and she came up with a draft for workshop. She went to the workshop, she got some good feedback, and then shows it to her sister before she submits it, thinking her sister could help her make it sound better. And she's right. Her sister helps her with grammar and punctuation and rewrites a few sentences to make the transition smoother and the vocabulary a little bit more elevated. Laren then turns that paper in for a grade. You say 1.3, and it may come as a bit of a shock that I'm calling this actually a nicely in the middle of 3. It's problematic. Is it intentional plagiarism in the sense that Laren is trying to pass someone else's work off as her own? No. But Laren has abandoned agency here, and I think the important thing is that she let her sister rewrite a couple sentences, and the language of this scenario makes it clear to me that Laren just like, thanks, this is good, and just puts it right on Canvas or puts it right in the submission. And that's not quite what we're looking for, because when you have someone else give you feedback, which is a totally valuable thing, and this, to be very clear, is not here to tell you not to get feedback from others, be it professional or friends and family, you just have to maintain the agency. You have to think about how it would ultimately sound if you wrote the idea that you think is a good idea. So letting someone rewrite your content and just giving it to submission, that gets into that gray area where we're getting close to you've abandoned enough agency that this is now becoming someone else's work. In this scenario, I think the context makes it clear it was only a few sentences, so it's probably not a huge impact. But I think it's worth talking about, and I think it's worth calling a 3. So be aware that when you have someone else give you ideas, you ultimately maintain agency and you are responsible for adapting it in your own way. Worf, poor, silly Worf. He's stumped with his assignment, and his friend Wesley is taking 123, maybe in a different section. And so he has maybe done this assignment that Worf is working on and is going to turn it in soon. And he gives Worf a copy of his assignment so he can see an example of how he approached it. Wesley is acting in good faith. Worf is not, because Worf takes Wesley's assignment, changes words, moves ideas around, and turns it in as his own. So you're calling this a 5, and I'm calling this a 5. We're pretty much on the same page here. Worf basically did Wesley dirty. He took Wesley's work and sent it off as his own. And then what would really suck is what if Wesley waited a little bit later than Worf to turn in this version of the paper, and they both have the same rough due dates or similar due dates in different sections? What if Wesley goes in after Worf, and now it looks like Wesley plagiarized Worf, and this becomes a whole huge situation. So yeah, this is a 5. Scenario 4, it's a little bit dense, and I think this is a good example to show you that working with sources that have very precise information can have very precise outcomes. We have precise language talking about 4 types of HPV, 2 types of cervical cancer cases, and 2 types of genital warts being prevented by Gardasil. And Deanna wants to use that language, but she tries to paraphrase it. And I think the problem here is while you're saying this is a 2, again, I know I'm right in the middle on so many things. This is a 3 because of a couple of critical factors. Deanna says that 4 types of HPV, 2 types of cervical or of genital warts, that Gardasil prevents against 4 types of HPV and 2 types that cause genital warts, but condenses that down into 4 types of HPV and herpes. This is way imprecise, and I can guarantee you that the language used here on this website that Deanna took from was probably picked over and tailored with multiple lawyers and very precise attributions. And to paraphrase it down that much might risk some different meaning. And I think that that happens here because she's just kind of lumping in HPV and herpes, and it's not that simple. Medically, without going into the medical jargon, she may have risked making it sound wrong from what it actually was intended. So just messy. It's not plagiarism, it's just messy. Same thing happened with the girls and women, or sorry, different thing happened with the girls and women ages 9 to 26. She says females between the ages of 9 and 26. That, it's not plagiarism because clearly she's citing, clearly she's attributing, she's not trying to pass anything off. But I don't think as a paraphrase that's substantially different enough that she can really say that she can just take that language and change a couple of words. So be aware of that possible impact. Excuse me. Beverly and Will. In Beverly's English 123 class, peer workshopping occurs before the final draft is due. Beverly is usually paired with Will. And Will is the best writer in the class as far as everyone thinks. He gives her feedback, and she decides to use his exact ideas and even some sentences suggested. Also, Beverly deletes any sentences Will notes as unnecessary. Now, you're saying 2.5, and now I'm going to go with, again, 2.3. I like 2.5. I didn't do any decimals personally myself because I didn't want to get into that messy area. And I think that you may be wondering why this is different than the situation with Laren and her sister. And I think the critical thing is that she decides to use the exact ideas and the exact sentences. At least she makes a choice, but still functionally it's about the same. She's used exact language. Maybe she's been a little bit more deliberative in how she decided to use it, but it's not radically different than what maybe Will has suggested. So again, she's abandoning agency. It's messy. Beverly should have done a little bit more if she thought Will had a great idea to work Will's concepts into her own language. Scenario 6. Jordy is researching graphic novels and he needs to include a definition of literature to prove that graphic novels have literary merit. He finds a literature or an online definition, which is a problem by itself, that he likes. The body of written works of a language, period, or culture, imaginative or creative writing, especially of recognized artistic value. He decides to paraphrase that into literature is anything that is creatively written and refers to anything artistic, such as graphic novels. You say 1.7, I say 2. Again, I'm using this not because this is a plagiarism, but this is really sketchy. This is really almost 3. Maybe I could have gone away with a 2, 3. It's not intentional plagiarism. We're not unintentional plagiarism here, but he definitely misrepresented the content of a source. They do not say anything about graphic novels, and by positioning it as he did inside his cited sentence, his paraphrased sentence with the phrase graphic novels, he's implying that his source used that language or made that concession, and they did not. It would be simple for him to say, and literature is anything that creatively written and refers to anything artistic. Put your citation there and say in another sentence, this applies to graphic novels because they have creativity and they're artistic. And then he wouldn't be in the same mess. This isn't plagiarism, but I like to call this out because this is something that people do when they're working with sources by accident that creates factual errors unintentionally. And factual errors we have to treat much more harshly. I would probably take a significant portion of a letter grade off for this one glitch because he's misrepresented a source even though it wasn't intent. So this is a factual error that you should be very careful of. Jean-Luc, you fool, Jean-Luc. He realizes the structure in his argument paper is the same as his persuasive speech for his speech class. He's a professional gamer and he wants to talk about the legitimacy of professional gaming as a sport. This speech works on the same content, so he records himself giving the speech and then he types it out word for word. He turns that in his English 123 paper. This was unusual. I usually have a bit more drift here, and you're calling a 3.7 essentially a 4, as am I. And I'm glad that you see this, because I've usually had people go more into the 2 range, or even calling it, no, this isn't that problem, this is 1. And I think maybe we contribute to this fact that I made a very clear point earlier in the semester to call out double submissions or self-plagiarism. Yeah, this is self-plagiarism. He's not engaging in good faith to fulfill the work that the assignment requested. He didn't presumably contact either of these instructors in this scenario, so he's essentially bypassed a requirement to produce new work for a separate class. I think that we'll leave it at that. I'm glad you see it the same way I do. This is a situation that's a little sticky. Self-plagiarism can feel ethically a little dubious to people because they feel like, hey, I did the work, why can't I reuse it? But it's really just a matter not of the work itself, but of how you engage in good faith with the assignment requirements, and the expectation that you're producing something that's going to fulfill those requirements and be assessed as a fulfillment of those requirements. And if you don't do that here, then there's really nothing that you can say is new. I'm going to sneeze, I'm sorry. Maybe. Maybe not. All right, Tasha. Excuse me. Tasha needs to add more information to her persuasive paper. She recently attended a lecture on climate change for a biology class. During the lecture, she took careful notes, and she decides to use those notes to help lengthen her paper. Since the notes are mostly paraphrases of the material lecture presented, Tasha decides she doesn't need to include any citations in the paper for these notes. You're calling it 2.8. I'm calling it a 3. I see that you're kind of dialing on the idea this is an error. And I think that it's, again, not something intentionally being presented to try and play off someone else's content as her own. But I think she has a really high chance of misrepresenting her own content here. Or misrepresenting the content that she's drawing from in the initial lecture. Maybe she did take careful notes, and maybe there's no problem. But ultimately, is this knowledge really something that can be common knowledge? This might be getting messy, and she might be accidentally plagiarizing someone in their meaning, in their content, and not giving them appropriate credit. It would probably manifest in a way that me reading this paper would flag it and say, hey, this is really precise content. Do you have a source for this? And we go from there. Scenario 9. Data has collected several pieces of evidence about the Vietnam War on his paper. He relies on several newspaper articles written during and after the conflict. He writes a description of the Tet Offensive. He properly cites direct quotations and eyewitness accounts. However, he does not cite basic background information, such as names, dates, and geographical place names. You say 2.7? You guys are hard. This is a 1. I mean, I think the critical thing is he properly cites the stuff that can be interpretive or evaluative, I should say. And he doesn't need to cite things like proper names, dates, and geographical place names for something that could be considered significantly in the public record and common knowledge. Historical dates and facts, unless it's a really nuanced piece where you're going to be making some sort of argument that something happened that people maybe don't know, maybe then you should cite it. But I think that for something as well known as major conflicts in the Vietnam War, he's okay to have done what he did here. I don't think really I'd see a problem with it. It's not specialized knowledge, essentially. All right, so all this accidental plagiarism talk, I want to kind of talk about how you can avoid that one, because most of these scenarios here are in that accidental plagiarism vein. Someone did something that's in that 2, 3, 4 range, maybe more, just 3. And so the unintentional and accidental stuff is something where you just probably didn't accurately use a source, or you inaccurately attributed it. And it's a common challenge that we can avoid. I encourage you to contact me with some concerns if you think you haven't cited something correctly. But the best way, as we're going to get into the next 2 slides, to avoid accidental plagiarism is to learn effective and responsible practices for quoting and paraphrasing. So in quoting directly, this means you're taking a specific statement of a passage from an author and using it word for word. The quotes are, the words you quote are original to the author and quoting, sorry, messed up my language there. The words you're quoting are original to the author and you are quoting and not taking from any other source. You're not putting anyone else's words in this person's mouth. You're being good faith representative of what they said. You cannot rephrase these or make any modifications in any way. And you can essentially simply copy the document and match the formatting, please, and punctuating with quotation marks. This is much more straightforward. People tend to quote directly pretty effectively. Make sure, of course, you're citing it. That's always an important thing. I do want to bring up that you don't need to always quote entire sentences. Sometimes a critical few words can match with your paraphrasing in the first half. And that's called partial quoting, or I think that's something you can consider trying to take on as a challenge if you haven't done much of that yet. So you begin, say you have a 3 or 4 long sentence long selection from someone else's content that ultimately arrives in a very critical phrase or critical explanation in one sentence. Maybe paraphrase that those first 3 sentences into something that's a little more concise, and then add the direct quote as a completion to the thought. Either with a separate sentence if that can thematically work for you, or syntactically work for you, or maybe you can just directly join it with an appropriate comma or leading in language, as long as you use quotes where the quote applies. I encourage you to pick quotes that are memorable either because of the author's word choice or tone. Don't just quote because you're not sure what the sentence means. So don't overuse quotes. As much as I'm saying that's the surefire way to make sure you're not plagiarizing, also make sure you don't overuse them, because that can really rob your voice and just diminish your ethos. You need to keep yourself in this paper. Paraphrasing. Unlike quoting directly, paraphrasing restates ideas. And so if you go back to our scenario where someone maybe restated ideas a bit too simplistically and ended up possibly changing meaning, here it's really critical that you understand the content and you reiterate in your own words while retaining the same meaning of the original author. If it's too complete to paraphrase, or it's just too complicated, the language is producing or trying to reproduce it with a paraphrase would change the quality of it or the meaning of it, you have to direct quote. But you must still attribute and cite all the paraphrase selections you do use. So this is different from summarizing, where you may be talking about a piece in a large, broad swoop, where you really can't cite any one page or 2 pages. Here, paraphrasing should still be essentially the same thing as quoting as far as your citations and your attributions. All right, so let's come to an end here with a couple of final slides. Talk about a conference draft. Like a workshop draft, a conference draft is a complete version of the assignment. I do a conference draft in this class with complete length, all sources, all content, and formatting is complete, and all the key requirements are present. Of the final paper, because I want to make sure it's a good chance for us to have one quality interaction over your draft before you turn around and give me the true final version of it. So it's essentially something you feel is solidly a mid-B paper. If you turn it in the conference draft and you just left it there, you know you're turning in a B paper. So that means nothing can be missing. It means nothing can really be really far off from being complete. As I've said before, your phrasing, your writing clarity can still be a bit crunchy, can still be a little bit off and need some revision, but the content and the organization, everything is essentially there. Detailed instructor feedback happens in this conference. So essentially, I give you all of the heavy feedback you would get on the final version if I was only doing one version. And that means that you'll get less feedback on the final, because essentially all the major changes and all the major improvements should have happened in the conference draft to the final version. It's given to you at that stage, so you have a chance to make some significant changes, and it's expected you will, as the assignment guidelines explain. To do. So due Friday, July 31st is our final planned research tutorial module. Make sure you complete that quiz. And on that same night, I'm pushing back again one day the submission of your conference draft. Now, this is the workshop submission, not your final submission of the first draft. I know language can get a little bit confusing here, but essentially the conference draft is going to have a total of 4 times you submit some version of it to Canvas. The first is your workshop prior to turning it in to me. Second is you turn it into me. The third is a workshop next week of the final version of the paper after the conference draft has happened. And the fourth is the final, done, complete final version of your researched argument paper. So due Sunday will be the workshop feedback on that conference draft. Again, pushed back one day. Due Monday will be a submission of your revised conference draft for instructor feedback. Again, essentially pushed back one day. And then we will start the day after that with instructor draft conferences. So hopefully this is all clear to you. Of course, I encourage you to let me know if it's not. But other than that, there's not going to be much more to talk about. I have one small lecture coming on Thursday to give you kind of some pointers on author tagging and just using engaging language, but that won't take as long as this lecture did. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in a couple days, and let me know if you want to take advantage of any of those conferences prior to the actual planned conferences. That way we have a chance to talk in depth if you want it. Have a good day.